Imagine a wall of water, like literally a wall of water, the height of a 70-story skyscraper. And it's not just a rising tide or some bad storm surge. It is a sheer, solitary cliff face of hyper-compressed ocean, and it's sweeping across the continent at the speed of a commercial airliner.
Right, which is just a terrifying image to even try to hold in your head.
Totally. And the thing is, this wasn't triggered by an earthquake. It was triggered by a rock, something roughly the mass of a small moon, slamming into the Earth's surface at like 60 kilometers per second.
Exactly.
The atmosphere above you just instantly tears open, creating this massive vacuum that pulls the mesosphere straight down to the crust. And then the ocean floor fractures beneath you, right? It's boiling from the inside out because the Earth's mantle is explosively decompressing.
Yeah, you're talking about total, just planetary scale kinetic annihilation at that point.
Right. Now, I want you, the listener, to just imagine actually surviving that exact event. And not because you had a boat, because a boat wouldn't do anything, but because you just happened to be standing inside a very specific, ancient, city-sized acoustic bunker, and you're operating what is fundamentally a giant geological pair of active noise-canceling headphones.
It's an apocalyptic scenario, but it's countered by this equally mind-bending, almost incomprehensible level of technological defense.
And that contrast, that exact tension is why we are here today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking you on what I can really only describe as an intensely curious, radically perspective-shifting exploration of human history. Because for centuries, we've looked at these ancient scriptural texts.
Right, the stories of massive global floods or cities protected by invisible forces.
Exactly, or glowing boxes that just wipe out entire armies. And we've treated them like myths. We look at the physics of our modern world, and then we look at the poetry of these texts, and we say, well, the math just doesn't work out. It must be a metaphor. It's a spiritual allegory.
Yeah, we do that because the events described in those texts, they completely defy the standard laws of physics, at least as we traditionally apply them to historical analysis. So we just neatly categorize them as theological rather than literal. It makes them fit into our comfortable, safe understanding of what ancient people were actually capable of doing.
But what if, and this is the big what if today, what if the math actually does work? What if it's not a metaphor at all, but an incredibly precise engineering blueprint? And we simply haven't had the scientific vocabulary to read it properly until right now.
Which brings us to the focus of today's conversation. We are unpacking this revolutionary singular framework that was entirely conceived by Dr. Khaled Waleed.
Yes, Dr. Waleed's work.
It is a staggering synthesis, honestly. Dr. Waleed has taken modern geophysics, quantum mechanics, fluid dynamics, astrophysics, and he's basically overlaid them directly onto ancient scriptural texts just to see where the raw data intersects.
It's wild. So our mission today is to unpack Dr. Waleed's astonishing thesis. He argues that ancient scriptural events, and we're going to focus heavily on the mechanics of Noah's flood and the physical functions of the Ark of the Covenant today, he argues these were not metaphors. They were not like supernatural magic.
No, not at all in his view.
Right. In Dr. Waleed's framework, these texts are highly advanced, literal, and meticulously accurate accounts of meteoritic impacts and frequency-based physical defense systems.
Now, before we jump into the hard physics of all this, we do need to offer a very clear disclaimer for you listening. In this deep dive, we are going to be exploring religious texts and some highly radical interpretations of global history. And this is all based entirely on Dr. Waleed's research.
Yeah, we want to be completely transparent with you that we are acting purely as impartial guides to Dr. Waleed's source material here.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing specific religious doctrines, and we aren't validating these massive historical claims ourselves. We are just here to explore the architecture of his ideas because they are so uniquely fascinating.
Right. Our job is simply to take Dr. Waleed's framework, lay the schematics out on the table, and just help you understand the sheer scale of the mechanics he is proposing. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand Dr. Waleed's framework, we don't start with ancient Hebrew or Arabic translations. We actually have to start with pure, hard physics.
We do. Before Dr. Waleed even touches the story of Noah or the Ark, he goes out of his way to establish this rigorous, uncompromising geophysical baseline. He asks a really highly specific question. He says, what is the exact mechanical difference between a massive tectonic seabed earthquake and a meteoritic shock pulse?
And it turns out, if you actually look at the fluid dynamics and the energy transfer, they're completely different animals. Like, you can't even compare them.
You really can't. They operate under entirely different physical laws. So let's look at the tectonic pulse first, which would be your standard massive extinction-level sea quake. Dr. Waleed explains that these events, by definition, they originate underground. They are driven by the movement of tectonic plates or maybe volcanic decompression deep beneath the ocean floor.
Right, they happen deep down in the lithosphere. He points out in his research that they can vary in depth from anywhere between 5 to 700 kilometers below the surface, which is incredibly deep inside the Earth's crust and upper mantle.
It is. And that depth is actually the defining characteristic of how the energy behaves. Because these tectonic quakes originate deep inside solid rock, the energy they produce, which geologists refer to as P waves, or primary compressional waves, and S waves, secondary shear waves, that energy has to travel through that solid, dense medium of rock.
Makes sense.
Right. Now, Dr. Waleed notes that these waves travel through the Earth's crust at a relatively slow speed, relatively speaking. He clocks the standard propagation at about 5 to 8 kilometers per second.
Which, sure, sounds incredibly fast to a human being, right? 8 kilometers a second is hypersonic. But on a planetary scale, when you were talking about moving massive amounts of geological mass, it is actually quite sluggish.
It's very sluggish. Furthermore, and this is absolutely crucial for understanding Dr. Waleed's later analysis of the texts, the energy of a tectonic earthquake is strictly limited. It is entirely bottlenecked by the mechanical tension stored in the rocks.
I really want to drill into that for a second because the physics here totally matter. When a tectonic plate is subducting under another plate, it gets stuck, right? The rock begins to deform, and it stores up all this elastic potential energy.
Like pulling back a rubber band.
Exactly like a rubber band. But rocks have a physical limit, a yield strength. They can only bend so much before the molecular bonds literally snap. And once they snap, that stored potential energy is released as kinetic energy, creating the earthquake.
Right.
Dr. Waleed makes the point that while this release can be devastating, there is a hard mathematical ceiling to how much energy can be unleashed, and that's dictated by the sheer tensile strength of the geological material. A rock simply cannot hold infinite energy. It has to break.
Exactly. And the release of that energy happens over time. A tectonic event features waves rolling out over seconds, sometimes many minutes, with a long, drawn-out frequency signature. It's a localized tearing of the crust that just sort of radiates outward.
Now, contrast that entirely with Dr. Waleed's description of a meteoritic pulse. When a bolide, a massive space object, impacts the ocean, the geophysical signature is radically, fundamentally different from a tectonic event.
Completely different.
First of all, let's talk about the depth. According to Dr. Waleed's baseline, a meteor strike doesn't originate 500 kilometers down in the mantle. It originates exactly at the boundary layer, 0 kilometers depth. Surface impact.
0 depth, and a velocity that is honestly almost hard to conceptualize in terrestrial terms. Dr. Waleed points out that the initial velocity of a meteor entering the atmosphere and striking the surface is ultra-fast. We are looking at velocities ranging from 11 to 72 kilometers per second at the exact moment of impact.
And this right here brings us to the core of Dr. Waleed's energy differential. Remember how the tectonic quake is artificially limited by the bending tension of the rocks?
The rock breaking point.
Right. A meteor strike has no such bottleneck at all. Its energy output is limited only by the universal laws of kinetic energy. Dr. Waleed anchors his whole theory on the classic physics formula. E equals 1/2 mv squared. Kinetic energy equals half the mass of the object times the velocity squared.
And when you are dealing with an object that weighs billions or maybe even trillions of tons, and it's traveling at up to 72 kilometers a second, well, the v squared part of that equation means the kinetic energy goes completely off the charts. It exponentiates.
It's an astronomical point source injection of energy. It doesn't happen over several minutes of rolling waves like a quake. As Dr. Waleed describes it, it happens in a fraction of a millisecond. All of that kinetic mass is violently transferred into the Earth instantly.
Just
boom. It is a catastrophic, singular shock wave that rips through the 3 distinct mediums of our planet, the water, the atmosphere, and the lithospheric rock, all simultaneously.
Which is exactly why Dr. Waleed spends so much time outlining the unique physical phenomena that are entirely exclusive to a meteor strike. These are geophysical symptoms that a tectonic earthquake, no matter how powerful it is, simply cannot produce.
I really want to go through his list in detail because as you read his work, you realize this isn't just background information, this is his diagnostic checklist.
Yes.
This is the exact rubric he is going to use to evaluate the ancient texts a little later on. So, symptom number 1 of a meteoritic impact, instant vaporization of water at the impact site.
Let's explain the thermodynamics of that for a second. When a meteor hits the ocean at those extreme velocities, the kinetic energy transfer is so immense and so instantaneous that the water doesn't merely splash out of the way. The specific heat capacity of the ocean water is instantly overwhelmed.
It can't absorb the heat fast enough.
Right. So the water at the impact site undergoes an immediate phase change. It flashes instantly into a massive hyper-expanding column of superheated steam and plasma. We're talking millions of cubic tons of ocean that are simply vaporized into the atmosphere in a literal microsecond.
Which you cannot get from an earthquake. A fault line snapping at the bottom of the ocean doesn't just vaporize water into plasma.
No, definitely not.
So symptom number 2 in Dr. Waleed's framework, the displacement tsunami. And we need to be really precise with our fluid dynamics here because he argues this is fundamentally different from a standard earthquake tsunami.
It is entirely different. When a tectonic plate snaps upward during an earthquake, it physically lifts the entire water column above it. That vertical lift creates a broad, low-amplitude wave that travels across the ocean, and it really only grows in height when it reaches the shallow continental shelf.
Right.
But Dr. Waleed's model of a meteor impact describes a completely different mechanism.
Right. Because the meteor isn't lifting the water from below. It is violently plunging into it from above. It displaces the volume of the ocean radially outward from the surface. It is physically shoving billions of tons of water out of its own way.
And in physics, this creates what is known as a soliton, or a solitary wave. Because of the massive, localized kinetic injection, it creates a colossal, sheer wall of water that actually holds its shape. It creates a literal, moving mountain of water right there in the deep ocean, which radiates outward as a massive displacement shockwave.
Okay, symptom number 3 on his diagnostic checklist. Mid-air fragmentation or air bursts. Because these meteors hit the Earth's atmosphere at such extreme velocities, the air in front of the rock simply cannot move out of the way fast enough. The atmosphere physically compresses in front of the meteor, creating incredible ram pressure.
And that extreme atmospheric compression generates unbelievable heat and structural stress on the meteor itself. Often, Dr. Waleed points out, this stress causes the object to violently fragment just before hitting the surface, or sometimes simultaneously as it strikes.
Oh.
Yeah, and this fragmentation creates a massive atmospheric explosion. It generates a barometric pressure wave that can flatten forests and shatter structures for hundreds of miles before the actual ground wave even arrives.
Which leads directly into his final symptom. The immense thermal flash, the friction, the ram pressure, and the kinetic conversion create an instantaneous burst of blinding light and thermal radiation. Dr. Waleed makes it extremely clear that this thermal flash is intense enough to instantly incinerate organic material and melt surface rock over a vast radius, and that's entirely independent of the physical shockwave.
Just pure heat. And to ensure we truly grasp the scale of the energy transfer he is modeling here, Dr. Waleed uses a highly specific historical benchmark in his research, the Chicxulub meteor.
Okay, right.
This is the famous impact event from roughly 66 million years ago that hit the Yucatan Peninsula and triggered the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event.
The literal dinosaur killer.
Precisely. The dinosaur killer. Dr. Waleed details the exact geological and physical stats of that event to serve as his scale. The Chicxulub impact released kinetic energy equivalent to roughly 100 trillion tons of TNT.
Trillion.
Trillion. It excavated a transient crater in the Earth's crust that was 180 kilometers wide. The impact sent a seismic shockwave through the planet estimated at an 11 to 13 on the Richter scale.
Just for some context for you listening, the Richter scale is logarithmic. A magnitude 13 earthquake is an amount of energy that our modern tectonic plates literally cannot produce. It's beyond the physical limit of our crust.
And the water displacement. Dr. Waleed points to the geological evidence of global displacement tsunamis that were between 100 and 300 meters high.
300 meters. You are talking about a sheer wall of water, the height of a 70-story skyscraper, moving at hundreds of kilometers an hour, just sweeping across the entire globe. So, to really crystallize the physics here before we move on, a standard tectonic earthquake is like shifting your legs under the water in a bathtub.
That's a good way to picture it.
Right. You create some ripples. If you shift your legs really hard, you might splash some water over the edge of the tub. That's a tectonic tsunami. But Dr. Waleed is saying a meteor pulse is like firing a literal high-velocity cannonball directly into that exact same tub from point-blank range.
It's an excellent analogy. The sheer instantaneous transfer of energy, the massive physical displacement of the water volume, the explosive vaporization, they just operate on completely different mechanical planes.
And as I was reading Dr. Waleed's framework, I realized exactly why he spent so much time meticulously establishing this baseline. He isn't just trying to give his readers a crash course in geophysics for fun. He is building a forensic tool.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed is constructing a highly specific diagnostic checklist of physical symptoms. Instantaneous surface impact, massive atmospheric breach and barometric shock, instant water vaporization, an immense thermal flash, a singular kinetic ground wave, and deep ocean displacement tsunamis.
And once he has that forensic checklist totally locked in, he pivots. He takes modern astrophysics and applies it directly to human history. Specifically, he takes that exact checklist and lays it over the ancient scriptural accounts of Noah's flood.
Well, this is where Dr. Waleed's work begins to fundamentally rewrite the traditional historical narrative. Because for thousands of years, the accepted orthodox interpretation of the Great Flood has been entirely meteorological. Heavy rain.
Right, just lots of rain.
The theological consensus has always been that it rained incredibly hard for 40 days and 40 nights, the local river basins overflowed, sea levels gradually rose, and then known Earth was drowned.
But Dr. Waleed looks at the actual original scriptural texts. He overlays his geophysical checklist, and he flatly rejects the meteorological model. He says, no, the text isn't describing a prolonged rainstorm. If you read the literal translation through the lens of fluid dynamics, it is perfectly describing a catastrophic meteor strike.
Let's trace his specific correlations here. He starts with the atmospheric breach. Dr. Waleed examines the specific ancient verse that describes opening the gates of heaven with pouring water. Now, traditionally, commentators have looked at gates of heaven opening and concluded it must just be a poetic way of saying heavy rain clouds bursting.
But I really want to push back on that traditional view because Dr. Waleed's interpretation makes so much more physical sense. Pouring water implies a continuous, heavy stream, sure, but how does a meteor cause that? I mean, we just established that the meteor vaporizes water, so where does the pouring rain actually come from in his model?
It comes from the atmospheric vacuum. Dr. Waleed argues that the text describes the exact microsecond of a massive bolide breaching the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah.
Remember the physics of the entry we just talked about? An object the size of a mountain moving at 70 kilometers a second physically shoves the atmosphere out of its way, creating a massive, hyper-pressurized energetic tear.
Yeah.
It literally creates a temporary vacuum tunnel straight through the mesosphere and stratosphere.
Like a localized hole in the sky.
Yes, a hole in the sky. And when that meteor hits the ocean surface, creating that instant vaporization we discussed, all of that superheated steam, millions of tons of vaporized ocean, is violently sucked up into that atmospheric vacuum.
Oh, wow.
But gravity and atmospheric pressure immediately reassert themselves. The vacuum tunnel violently collapses. This shockwave, this atmospheric breach, violently pulls all of that displaced atmospheric mass, cosmic moisture, and vaporized ocean back down to the surface in a concentrated, hyper-violent deluge.
So in Dr. Waleed's framework, the pouring water isn't a drizzle from a nimbus cloud. It's the collapsed atmospheric column and a vaporized ocean crashing back down to Earth as a singular catastrophic event. It's a violent, energetic, fluid dynamic reaction, not a localized weather pattern.
Which brings us to the next and perhaps most fascinating textual correlation Dr. Waleed makes. He focuses on a very specific phrase found in the ancient text describing the onset of the flood, Faran al-Tanur. This translates from the ancient Arabic to the oven boiled over, or the oven erupted.
And historically, theologians and commentators have really struggled with this line, because why would a text mention a baker's oven boiling over during a global flood? It seems totally out of place. Some ancient scholars thought it was a metaphor for God's anger boiling over. Others literally thought it meant the floodwaters first started pouring out of a specific cursed bread oven in a local village.
This is a strange phrase, but Dr. Waleed abandons the metaphorical and the localized interpretations entirely. He takes a purely physical, geological approach. He hypothesizes that this oven is literal. It is the thermal and seismic epicenter of the meteor strike itself.
This blew my mind. Walk us through the geology of this. How does an impact crater become an oven?
Think back to the cannonball in the bathtub. When that massive kinetic mass hits the Earth's crust beneath the ocean, the energy transfer doesn't just stop at the water. It fractures the lithosphere. The immense kinetic pressure and the thermal flash superheat the immediate crustal zone. That localized impact crater becomes a literal planetary oven.
But why does it boil over with water specifically?
Because of the Earth's subterranean hydrology. Beneath the ocean floor, there are massive underwater aquifers and subterranean springs, and they're locked under immense confining pressure from the heavy rock above them. When the meteor shatters that crustal layer and injects trillions of joules of thermal energy right into the ground, that confining pressure is instantaneously removed.
Oh, wow. So the water trapped inside the Earth's crust experiences rapid decompression, melting, and flash boiling.
Exactly. The supercritical water trapped in the crust violently changes state. The Earth's crust cracks, and the subterranean water, suddenly exposed to the catastrophic thermal energy of the impact, explosively boils up from beneath the ocean floor.
So in Dr. Waleed's model, you have a perfect simultaneous description of a singular event. You have the gates of heaven opening from the atmospheric vacuum collapsing above you, and the oven boiling over from the Earth's crust, fracturing and aquifer superheating below you.
It's completely synced up.
And Dr. Waleed notes how the scripture explicitly states that these upper and lower waters met for matter already predestined. It is a flawless description of a simultaneous surface-level kinetic impact, causing equal and opposite violent fluid reactions both in the upper atmosphere and deep within the Earth's crust.
And then he addresses the physical nature of the water itself. Dr. Waleed points out that the scripture specifically describes the floodwaters as waves like mountains.
Which, again, the traditional view says, oh, it's just poetic exaggeration. They saw a really bad 10-foot storm surge and called it a mountain.
But Dr. Waleed aligns this textual description perfectly with the fluid dynamics of a meteoritic displacement tsunami from his diagnostic baseline.
Right, because as we establish, a tectonic tide, no matter how severe the earthquake, does not look like a mountain. A standard tsunami out in deep ocean is often less than a meter high, right? You wouldn't even really notice it if you were in a boat out in the deep water. It's just a rapid, endless rising of the tide that sweeps inland when it hits the shallow coast.
But a displacement tsunami, a soliton created by shoving billions of tons of water outward from a central localized impact zone at hypersonic speeds, that creates a singular, sharp, highly defined shock wave of water.
Because all the energy is concentrated.
Exactly. Because all that kinetic energy is pushing a defined mass of water in a radial ring, it literally forms a moving mountain of water. Dr. Waleed argues that waves like mountains is not a poetic flourish. It is a precise, literal description of a deep ocean displacement soliton. It perfectly matches the geophysical signature of a short, sharp meteoritic pulse rather than the prolonged, multi-wave rolling of a tectonic earthquake.
Okay, so Dr. Waleed builds this incredibly rigorous, geophysically sound case that the ancient texts are actually recording the exact physical markers of what he calls a covenant impact. A hyper-destructive, highly energetic meteor strike meant to cleanse the Earth. But this is exactly where I hit a massive logical wall reading his work.
I think I know what you're going to say. You're referring to the survival mechanism.
Yes. I mean, if we were talking about an event on the scale of Chicxulub, if Dr. Waleed is right, and this is an atmospheric airburst, a thermal flash that incinerates everything for hundreds of miles, a crust-shattering seismic wave, and mountain-sized displacement waves, how on earth does a wooden boat survive that?
It doesn't.
Right. You don't just chop down some gopher wood, build a big box, cover it in pitch, and bob happily over a shockwave that just melted the ocean floor. The physical material of the boat would be instantly vaporized by the thermal flash. Or, even if it survived the heat somehow, the initial kinetic shock wave traveling through the water would shatter the wood into splinters before the displacement wave even lifted it.
That is the ultimate test of his framework, isn't it? And it's fascinating because Dr. Waleed agrees completely with your assessment. A simple wooden boat bobbing on the open ocean would absolutely not survive the physics of a covenant impact.
So how does he resolve it? Because there is a survivor in the story.
This brings us to the next crucial phase of his framework, which introduces his concept of selective protection. Dr. Waleed argues that the flood was not just a random chaotic act of cosmic violence. In his interpretation, it was a hyper-targeted cosmic event, governed by highly specific physical laws. And therefore, surviving it required a hyper-targeted, scientifically sound method of protection.
Which fundamentally shifts the entire focus. It moves the narrative completely away from the carpentry of the boat itself and shifts the focus to the location of the boat. This brings us to Dr. Waleed's geographic focus.
Precisely. Because a wooden boat exposed on the open sea would be vaporized, Dr. Waleed introduces a massive paradigm shift into the story. He posits that the Ark's survival didn't depend on how thick the wood was. It depended entirely on its geographical alignment with a specific, highly engineered cosmic port.
A port?
Yes, and that port, according to Dr. Waleed's translation of the text, is Jerusalem, which is frequently referred to in ancient contexts as Baka.
This absolutely blew my mind when I realized what he was proposing. We are moving from a story about an ancient sailor on the open sea to a story about a highly specific, geographically anchored, frequency-stabilized survival bunker.
Let's outline the physics of this salvation, starting with what Dr. Waleed terms resonance stabilization. He posits that Jerusalem, specifically Mount Moriah, and the surrounding sacred precinct, possesses a stable intrinsic frequency signature that acts as a localized anchor point for higher cosmic realms.
But let's translate that into geophysics for a second. What does a stable frequency signature actually mean when a magnitude 13 shockwave is tearing the Earth's crust apart?
It comes down to acoustic impedance and vibration damping. During the chaotic, destructive impact of the meteor, the frequencies and vibrations of the Earth's crust were completely tearing themselves apart. You have Rayleigh waves and love waves violently shaking the ground, causing catastrophic structural and cellular collapse.
Right. If you are standing outside, the raw kinetic energy of the shockwave hits your body, and the acoustic violence simply liquefies your internal organs. The sheer vibration kills you.
But Dr. Waleed argues that the ancient bedrock of Jerusalem and the specific geography of the city itself acted as a massive vibration damper, a planetary acoustic shock absorber. He suggests that entering the specific perimeter of the sacred precinct meant entering a localized zone of frequency stillness.
I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this. How does the city act as a damper? Is he suggesting the bedrock itself? Perhaps the specific limestone or underlying granite strata of Mount Moriah acted as an acoustic metamaterial, where the incoming seismic waves hit the boundary of the city and the specific geological density caused the waves to reflect or destructively interfere with themselves?
That is exactly the principle he is pointing toward. The geological strata and the ancient architecture actively damped the destructive vibrations. The incoming kinetic wave hit the perimeter, and the intrinsic frequency of the location forced a state of stabilization, so that biological life inside wouldn't just disintegrate from the sheer acoustic and kinetic force of the impact.
And this geographical anchoring ties directly into how Dr. Waleed radically reinterprets the ultimate resting place of the Ark. Because the traditional scripture says the Ark came to rest on Mount Judy. And for centuries, explorers have wandered around mountains in Turkey or the broader Middle East looking for a physical peak named Judy where a boat might be buried.
But Dr. Waleed translates the word Judy completely differently. He argues that in the original linguistic context, it shouldn't be viewed merely as a proper noun, like a random name of a hill. He translates Judy as a station of quality and solidity.
So it's a qualitative description of a geographic anchor point, not a name.
Yes, a point of ultimate stability. And he places this specific nodal point right at the heart of Jerusalem. Dr. Waleed argues that the Ark didn't just passively float around on the floodwaters for months until it coincidentally bumped into a random mountain peak. He says the Ark was magnetically, tectonically, and physically drawn to this exact fulcrum in Jerusalem.
So the city was the target destination the entire time. It was the only safe harbor, the only geographical coordinate on the planet naturally or artificially designed to withstand the kinetic physics of the impact.
And Dr. Waleed goes into extensive detail explaining how it withstood the impact, physically speaking. He points to the natural topography of the ancient region, the deep valleys and mountains that ancient peoples had carved into fortresses and homes. He says these highly complex geographic features acted as literal physical breakwaters.
Because when those mountain-like displacement tsunamis radiated outward from the oceanic impact zone, they possessed unimaginable kinetic energy. But when that moving wall of water hit the specific carved topography of the mountains surrounding Jerusalem, the geometry of the terrain forced the water to channel, crash into itself, and shatter.
The terrain did the work.
Right, the topography mathematically diffused the kinetic energy of the soliton before it could annihilate the center of the city.
Exactly. The landscape itself was the first line of kinetic defense. But, as Dr. Waleed points out, it wasn't just water they had to survive. What about the thermal flash we discussed? The blinding, incinerating heat of the atmospheric ram pressure.
Right. If you are sitting in a wooden boat, you are entirely exposed to the sky. You cook.
But Dr. Waleed notes that the rock architecture of the city, the deep caverns and stone structures of the sacred precinct, provided the ultimate thermal insulation. The inhabitants weren't exposed on the surface. They were encased in a rock-hewn sanctuary that absorbed and deflected the atmospheric incineration. The thermal coefficient of the massive stone walls acted as a heat sink, preventing the interior from superheating.
It's brilliant. It really is. But honestly, the most astonishing, almost science fiction level part of Dr. Waleed's analysis of Jerusalem's defense systems has to be the pressure regulation.
The pressure shields, yes. This is where Dr. Waleed's framework truly bridges the gap between ancient text and advanced physics.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because let's say you survive the thermal flash by hiding behind a rock wall. And let's say the topography shatters the tsunami before it drowns you. An atmospheric airburst from a Chicxulub-level meteor creates an immediate violent barometric pressure drop, followed by an immense pressure spike.
A massive shock to the system.
Yeah, and if you are a biological organism, that barometric fluctuation will literally rupture your lungs and cause your blood to boil. It doesn't matter if you are safely behind a thick limestone wall. If the air pressure violently fluctuates inside that space, you die instantly.
Which is why Dr. Waleed claims that the ancient city walls of Jerusalem and the specific architecture of the sanctuary acted as active pressure shields. They were either highly engineered or naturally situated through divine geometry to maintain internal atmospheric equilibrium.
How does that work physically? Are we talking about a series of interconnected chambers acting as Helmholtz resonators, basically baffling and equalizing the air pressure as the shockwave passes over the top?
Exactly like that. Even as the atmosphere outside the city was violently tearing apart and collapsing in that vacuum tunnel we discussed earlier, the perimeter of the sanctuary maintained a stable microclimate. The architectural geometry damped the barometric swings, maintaining a bubble of normal, livable atmospheric pressure. Dr. Waleed explicitly and deliberately refers to this entire geographical setup as the sacred Faraday cage.
I love that term so much, a Faraday cage. Because in standard physics, a Faraday cage is usually a conductive mesh that blocks electromagnetic fields from entering a space, right? But Dr. Waleed isn't describing some magical, glowing force field from a fantasy movie. He is describing a highly technical, acoustically damped, thermally insulated, pressure-regulated bunker.
A survival mechanism based entirely on the mastery of physical laws. Nothing supernatural about the physics themselves.
It's like they possessed giant city-size, noise-canceling headphones for a planetary explosion. The destructive kinetic and acoustic wave comes in. The city's specific architectural and geological frequency creates an inverse wave or a physical baffle, and you get pure atmospheric and acoustic silence inside the wall while the rest of the world ends outside.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights a profound philosophical and theological shift in Dr. Waleed's framework. In his view, the concept of salvation in these ancient texts wasn't just about building a boat and climbing a random high mountain to escape rising water. It wasn't about the mere manipulation of matter.
What was it about then? What's the core of it?
Salvation was entirely about aligning with the correct physical frequency and standing on the exact geographic coordinate designated by a higher cosmic order. You had to be in the exact right spot, tuned to the exact right frequency, utilizing the correct physical architecture to survive the physics of the purge.
Which naturally forces us to ask the biggest, most glaring mechanical question of this entire deep dive. Let's assume Dr. Waleed is right. Let's assume Jerusalem acted as a massive geological Faraday cage, a frequency-stabilized shock absorber that maintained atmospheric pressure against a Chicxulub-level meteor strike. What on earth was generating that protective field?
Because as you noted with the headphone analogy, you don't just get a city-sized active noise-canceling field and atmospheric pressure regulation simply from stacking some limestone blocks in a valley.
Right. Active wave cancellation, by definition, requires power. It requires a central power source. You need a microphone to read the incoming wave, a processor to calculate the inversion, and a massive power output to broadcast the destructive interference. You need a reactor. So where is the reactor in Dr. Waleed's framework?
This is where Dr. Waleed unveils his final and arguably most profound revelation. He points directly to the very heart of the sacred precinct, into the Holy of Holies, to identify exactly what was generating this field.
He points to the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes. But just as he reimagined Noah's Ark from a wooden boat into a geographical survival bunker, Dr. Waleed entirely redefines the physical nature of the Ark of the Covenant.
Because traditionally, if you ask a historian or a theologian, what is the Ark of the Covenant, it's described as an acacia wood chest, plated in gold. It's got the golden cherubim on top, and it holds the broken stone tablets of Moses and maybe Aaron's rod. It's universally viewed as a holy reliquary, a very sacred, untouchable museum display case.
But in Dr. Waleed's framework, that historical view is fundamentally mechanically flawed. He argues the Ark is not merely a box of holy keepsakes. He redefines it as a highly advanced functional piece of technology. He literally calls it a frequency generator and a resonance stabilizer.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of his generator. What exactly is it generating?
Dr. Waleed says the primary purpose of the Ark was to generate a highly specific energetic state called sakina. Now, in traditional theological translations, sakina is almost always translated as tranquility or peace, a purely spiritual feeling of calmness that descends on believers.
But Dr. Waleed rejects the purely spiritual translation, doesn't he? He translates sakina straight through the lens of quantum physics and electromagnetism.
Correct. He defines sakina as a literal state of static equilibrium. It is an active, protective electromagnetic and acoustic shield. When the Ark operates, it broadcasts this field of static equilibrium, which physically interacts with and neutralizes destructive, chaotic kinetic forces.
So it is the localized, concentrated emission of the exact frequency needed to damp the catastrophic vibrations of the meteor strike. It stiffens the local physical environment, rendering it immune to the kinetic wave. But Dr. Waleed makes one thing very clear in his writing. The Ark didn't work alone. It wasn't some magic battery that you could just pick up, carry out into the desert, and turn on.
No, it required a very specific docking station. It had to be plugged into the Earth itself.
It had to be mounted. And where was it mounted? Dr. Waleed explains it rested on the sacred rock, known as al-Mashar al-Haram, located at the exact topological center of the sanctuary.
And here's the core of the power generation. Dr. Waleed identifies this sacred rock not just as a piece of ordinary bedrock. He identifies it as a massive geological piezoelectric crystal.
Okay, we need to pause here and thoroughly explore this because this is the absolute crux of the mechanics in his theory. For our listeners who might not be materials scientists, what does piezoelectric mean and how does it generate power?
Piezoelectricity is a very real, highly documented physical phenomenon. It is the electric charge that accumulates in certain solid materials, most commonly quartz crystals, certain ceramics, and even biological matter like bone or DNA, in direct response to applied mechanical stress.
The easiest everyday way to think about it for you listening is a push-button cigarette lighter. When you push that hard plastic button down with your thumb, you are compressing a tiny spring-loaded hammer. That hammer violently snaps forward and hits a small piece of quartz crystal inside the lighter.
Exactly.
And the physical mechanical stress of that hammer hitting the quartz physically squeezes the crystal lattice.
And because of the specific atomic structure of the quartz, the way the silicon and oxygen atoms are arranged, that physical compression shifts the center of electrical charge within the crystal. It creates a dipole moment. The crystal takes that mechanical pressure and physically converts it into a sudden spark of high-voltage electricity. That spark arcs across the gap and lights the butane gas. That is the piezoelectric effect in a nutshell. Mechanical pressure converted directly into electrical power.
Now take that tiny cigarette lighter and scale it up to planetary dimensions. Dr. Waleed is arguing that the sacred rock, the foundation stone of the sanctuary, is a massive piezoelectric crystalline structure embedded deep into the bedrock of Mount Moriah.
And remember, the physics of our covenant impact we talked about. When the meteor struck the ocean, it sent an unimaginable magnitude 13 shockwave tearing through the Earth's lithosphere. That is a wave of pure mechanical, tectonic, and cosmic pressure rippling through the crust.
It is the ultimate hammer hitting the quartz.
Exactly. The seismic shock waves hit the deep bedrock of Jerusalem. They hit the sacred rock. And the rock, acting as a giant geological piezoelectric converter, took all of that apocalyptic, earth-shattering kinetic pressure and instantly converted it into a massive terawatt output of raw electromagnetic energy.
But raw electromagnetic energy is just a blast. It's lightning. It needs to be shaped, right? It needs to be modulated and directed to be useful as a shield. That is where the Ark of the Covenant comes in, isn't it?
Yes. Dr. Waleed posits that the Ark of the Covenant sat directly on top of this crystalline bedrock. It was plugged into the power source. As the sacred rock generated the raw piezoelectric power from the earthquake, the Ark acted as the central processor, the frequency generator. It absorbed that raw electrical energy, modulated it, and broadcast the Sakina, the static equilibrium shield, over the entire perimeter of the city.
So it literally fed on the kinetic pressure of the apocalypse in order to generate the electromagnetic shield that protected the city against the apocalypse. The harder the earth shook, the stronger the shield became. It is an absolutely breathtaking concept of ancient engineering.
It really is a perfect closed-loop defense system.
But I have to ask about the internal components of the Ark. Because if the Ark is a frequency generator, a piece of advanced technological hardware, what are the relics doing inside it? The broken stone tablets of Moses. You don't put stone tablets inside a microwave and expect it to work.
In a traditional sense, no. But Dr. Waleed reinterprets the internal relics entirely. He views the relics of Moses and Aaron not as historical keepsakes or museum pieces, but as the literal software of the device.
Software, like a computer program.
Yes, but written into matter. He interprets these items as physical manifestations of energetic codes or fundamental physical laws inscribed directly into crystalline structure.
Which actually aligns with modern data storage. I mean, we are already using fused quartz crystals to store digital data in 5D optical drives right now. The crystalline lattice can hold information, so Dr. Waleed is suggesting these stone tablets were essentially crystalline operating systems. They instructed the resonance box on exactly what frequency to output to achieve the Sakina.
Precisely. They were the algorithms that modulated the raw piezoelectric power. Furthermore, the ancient texts frequently describe angels that carry, surround, or maintain the Ark. In Dr. Waleed's physical translation, he strips away the imagery of winged men. He argues these angels represent literal cosmic physical forces.
Fundamental forces, like physics forces.
Exactly. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces. These are the messengers of the cosmos that keep the physical universe bound together. In his framework, these fundamental forces are what keep the Ark operational and suspended in its correct, highly active energetic state.
Okay, I am tracking the power source and the processor. But Dr. Waleed introduces one final, incredibly strange element to this defense system: the people themselves. He argues that by standing in the sacred precinct during the impact, the human inhabitants actually became a functional component of the machine. He says they became part of a phased array.
And this requires us to understand how wave propagation works in a phased array system, like modern radar or advanced cell towers.
Right. In a phased array, you don't just have one giant antenna broadcasting blindly in all directions. You have a grid of multiple smaller antennas that all emit the exact same signal. By carefully timing the microsecond that each antenna emits its signal, the waves expand and physically interact with each other in the air.
Yeah, overlap.
Yeah, and in some directions, the waves perfectly align crest to crest. They add together and become vastly stronger. That's called constructive interference. You form a targeted beam of energy. In other directions, they misalign, crest to trough, and cancel each other out entirely, which is destructive interference.
Exactly. It allows you to steer and shape a massive field of energy without physically moving the antenna. Now, apply that to Dr. Waleed's framework. He is arguing that the human inhabitants, properly prepared and physically present in the sanctuary, acted as biological antennas.
Because the human body is essentially a column of conductive salt water. We have our own dielectric properties and biological resonance frequencies.
Yes. Dr. Waleed suggests that by aligning themselves within the sacred geometry of the precinct, the people tuned their biological frequency to the Ark. Combined with the primary output of the Ark, they created a massive field of constructive interference. They amplified the Sakina, the static equilibrium, which formed an impenetrable electromagnetic boundary. This boundary perfectly phase-canceled the destructive, incoming meteoritic acoustic waves hitting the city walls.
So they didn't just hide from the apocalypse, they literally, biologically, tuned it out.
They were the final living component of the active noise cancellation system.
Okay, I have to step back for a second and just look at the entirety of what we've mapped out here. Dr. Waleed is basically asserting that the ancient world possessed a geological piezoelectric frequency generator powered by the fundamental cosmic laws inscribed on crystalline tablets, utilizing human biological resonance to create a phased array electromagnetic defense shield against a magnitude 13 Chicxulub-level meteor strike.
That is the complete summary of his thesis, yes. It's an incredible chain of logic.
That is incredibly hard to wrap your head around, especially if you were raised on the Sunday school version of these stories. So, what does this all mean for us today? How does Dr. Waleed's framework change how we are supposed to view human history and ancient technology?
It represents the ultimate paradigm shift in historical analysis. Dr. Waleed's thesis fundamentally asserts that the rigid divide we have constructed in our modern minds between a spiritual miracle and quantum physics is an utter illusion.
It's just an artificial boundary we made up because we lost the math.
Exactly. We look at an ancient text describing a city saved from utter destruction by a glowing box and a group of priests, and we immediately say, well, that's magic. That's a supernatural miracle from God interfering with physics. We say that because we don't understand the physical mechanism at play.
But in Dr. Waleed's framework, what ancient people recorded and what we sort of arrogantly dismiss as primitive myth were actually hyper-advanced, perfectly applied mechanics. They understood wave propagation, fluid dynamics, resonance damping, and piezoelectric electromagnetism on a level that we are only just barely beginning to grasp with modern quantum physics.
They weren't praying for a magical force field to violate the laws of nature. They were operating highly complex machinery that capitalized on universal physical laws to achieve a precise mechanical outcome.
It perfectly illustrates Arthur C. Clarke's famous third law, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Dr. Waleed is essentially taking the magic out of the ancient texts, and he is replacing it with highly rigorous engineering blueprints.
He is showing us that the true miracle of these ancient events isn't a violation of the laws of physics. The miracle is the absolute flawless mastery of those laws.
Let's do a quick recap because we have covered an enormous amount of highly technical ground today. We started with Dr. Khaled Waleed's unified theory, building a strict, uncompromising geophysical baseline. He showed us the exact mathematical and physical difference between a slow, tension-limited tectonic earthquake and the sheer, instantaneous kinetic violence of a meteor strike.
Right, and then he took that highly specific diagnostic checklist, the vacuum-induced atmospheric breach, the instantaneous thermal vaporization of the ocean, the crustal decompression melting, and the formation of solitary displacement tsunamis. And he mapped it flawlessly onto the ancient, literal descriptions of Noah's flood.
Yeah.
He argued compellingly that the pouring water and the oven boiling over were not poetic weather descriptions, but literal records of an atmospheric tear and a superheated crust resulting from a massive bolide impact.
From there, we looked at how anyone or anything could possibly survive the thermal and kinetic reality of such an event. Dr. Waleed proposed that survival required selective protection. It wasn't about a floating wooden boat, it was about the precise geographical alignment of Jerusalem, or Bakka. The ancient topography acted as physical acoustic breakwaters, and the city's specific geological architecture functioned as an active pressure shield, creating a sacred Faraday cage that maintained atmospheric and acoustic equilibrium while the outside world was physically obliterated.
And finally, we explored the technological heart of this entire system, the Ark of the Covenant. He redefined it not as a wooden box of holy relics, but as a highly advanced frequency generator resting on the massive piezoelectric crystal of the sacred rock. Together, acting as a converter and a processor, they harvested the immense tectonic pressure of the impact to generate the Sakina, an electromagnetic shield of static equilibrium. And this shield, supported by the biological resonance of the human phased array, actively neutralized the shock waves of the apocalypse.
It is an awe-inspiring, profoundly disruptive framework, and it really challenges us to rethink absolutely everything we thought we knew about our past. Why does this matter to you, the listener? Why should you care about a radical reinterpretation of ancient geology and scripture? Because Dr. Waleed's work forces us to ask a terrifying yet really thrilling question. Are these ancient texts merely poetic myths, simple stories we tell children to teach them morality? Or are they highly technical blueprints? Are they meticulously preserved records of physical realities, planetary cataclysms, and advanced technologies that we are only just beginning to rediscover with modern science?
It demands that we look at history with an entirely new lens. It asks us to respect the ancients not as primitive, superstitious storytellers, but as possible masters of a profound physical science that we, at some point in our history, simply forgot.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought. Something taken directly from the very end of Dr. Waleed's text. We didn't even get to fully explore the mechanics of it today, but it is something that builds on everything we've discussed, designed for you to mull over on your own.
Yes. Dr. Waleed poses this fascinating question at the conclusion of his analysis. If we accept the premise that the Ark of the Covenant and the sacred rock function together as a giant Earth-stabilizing frequency processor, basically a massive geological battery protecting the planet from cosmic instability, could the ancient, strictly prescribed ritual of the middle prayer, the Salat al-Wusta, actually be the scheduled periodic charging process required by cosmic law to keep this protective battery running?
I mean, think deeply about the implications of that. The daily rhythms of ancient rituals, the specific times, the synchronized movements, and the acoustic chanting. What if they were never meant to be mere spiritual devotion? What if they were the precise biological, acoustic, and electromagnetic maintenance routine required to keep the planetary defense shield online? What if human biology was always the required alternating current to maintain the Earth's piezoelectric lattice? The X-ray isn't broken, it never was. We just haven't been looking at the bones. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.